My father handed me a duffel bag and shut the door behind me. It was a Tuesday night in January, the kind where the wind slips past your coat collar and finds your bones. I stood on our porch, 17, pregnant and suddenly homeless. My right hand gripped the strap of a worn duffel bag. My left hand curled instinctively over my stomach, even though it was still flat. My father had just told me in the same tone he used to kill snakes on the farm that I was no longer his daughter. He didn't yell when I told them that would have been easier, I think. Instead, he pushed back from the dinner table, slow and stiff, like something in him cracked. My mother dropped her spoon. Her lips opened, but no words came out. "I'm pregnant," I'd said, voice low but steady. It was meatloaf night. Tuesdays were always meatloaf. I remember the smell more than the taste. Thick gravy, overcooked carrots. The creak of my father's chair, the sound of the world changing in 4 syllables. He didn't ask who the father was. Didn't ask if I was scared. Just stood there, jaw clenched, eyes not even on me. "You're not raising a baby under this roof," he said. Then he walked into the hallway, pulled out the old duffel I used for track meets, and set it by the front door. That was it. No more family, no more home. Just the cold porch and the bag half-zipped with a sweatshirt hanging out. The street lamp flickered. Somewhere down the block, someone's TV was too loud. Life kept going, like mine hadn't just fallen off a cliff. A few months before everything had been different. I'd been floating through my senior year on daydreams. Jake, my boyfriend, then talked about moving to Austin, starting a life I believed him. Believed in the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the room that made sense. But the summer after graduation, he changed. His texts slowed. His voice got quieter. One afternoon in October, he told me he had big plans, college, freedom, ambition, and I didn't fit. "It's not you," he said, standing in the park we used to meet in. "I just need to figure myself out." He walked away without looking back, and now, months later, my father did the same. I didn't cry. Not right then. I walked down the steps like my legs still belonged to me and turned left at the corner without thinking. My fingers were numb. My thoughts were quieter than the wind. Where do you go when your own parents lock the door behind you? That question echoed in my chest as I crossed through the empty neighborhood. The grocery store sign buzzed in the distance. I didn't have money. Didn't have a plan. Just one name that kept surfacing like a prayer. Iris, my grandmother. She lived 2 towns over. I hadn't seen her since Christmas 2 years before. She'd fought with my father and never came back for holidays, but I remembered her voice on the phone. Husky, warm, unshaken. "You're always welcome here, child," she'd told me once. I pulled my coat tighter and kept walking. They erased me like I never existed. By the time I reached the bus station, my feet were soaked through. I had $23 in my pocket, and the name, Iris, scribbled on a diner napkin I'd used to steady my nerves. One transfer and a long ride later, I was standing in front of her little white house with the crooked porch rail and frost clinging to the windows. She opened the door before I knocked. I must have looked like a ghost. Wet hair, red eyes, one hand still on my stomach like I was bracing for the next blow. "I figured it was you," she said, stepping aside. "You're early." She didn't ask questions, didn't make me explain anything, just poured tea into a chipped mug and pointed to the old couch with the quilt folded neatly on the back. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. "That's not a question." For the first few weeks, I barely spoke. I slept too much, ate too little. Iris moved around me like someone tending to a wounded animal, not rushing, not prying, just making sure I didn't forget how to breathe. Then came the doctor's visits, the slow changes in my body, the ache in my back, and the heaviness in my chest. I didn't know if I was more afraid of becoming a mother or becoming invisible. No one from home ever called. Not my mother, not my father, not even my cousins who used to slip me lifesavers during Sunday service. I had disappeared from the family picture entirely. It was as if I had died and no one sent flowers. I gave birth in late August. It was a hot day. My hands were shaking when the contractions started, and I thought I might pass out from the fear alone. But Iris was there. She held my hand through every breath, every cry. When it was over, she placed the baby in my arms with a reverence I hadn't seen in years. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He's got your chin." I named him Emery. after no one in the family, just a name that felt like it had its own strength. We took him home in a borrowed car seat, wrapped in a blanket Iris had knit during those long afternoons when I couldn't get off the couch. She moved slower by then, but her eyes were still sharp, her hands still steady. One day, when Emery was about 3, Iris sat on the porch with him while I folded laundry inside. I heard him ask, "Why don't I have a grandma like the other kids?" There was a long pause, then Iris said quiet and clear, "Because some people choose silence. But you were never missing anything." I stood in the hallway with a pair of tiny socks in my hand and tears running down my face. They hadn't just rejected me, they had cut me out clean, like I was never part of them to begin with. I didn't get even. I just got busy. I never set out to prove anything. I didn't daydream about showing them. I could make it without them. I was too tired, too broke, and too scared to carry pride around with me. What I carried was a lunch shift at Mel's Diner and a coffee can under the bed with a label in black marker. Emery's future. Every tip went in there, every extra quarter, every wrinkled 5. I didn't tell Emery what it was for. Not yet. He just thought the 10 sounded funny when he shook it. He grew fast. By the time he was 5, he had a head full of soft curls and eyes that asked more questions than I could keep up with. He wanted to know why clouds moved how bread rose and what made light bulbs glow. He built strange little towers out of toothpicks and asked if airplanes breathed. We didn't have much. Our house had creaky floorboards and the windows iced over in winter, but it had a rhythm. Pancakes on Saturdays, jazz on the radio, and Iris in her rocker with a book that she never seemed to finish. One night when Emery was about 6, he came home from school with a drawing of a family tree. His was mostly empty. "Do I not have real grandparents?" he asked, holding up the paper. I looked at Iris. She set her teacup down, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "They missed the chance, but you were never missing anything." I watched from the kitchen doorway as Emery nodded and climbed onto her lap, like that answer was enough. Later, when I was scrubbing a pan that didn't need scrubbing, I cried. Not the loud kind, the slow kind, the kind that slides down your face and disappears into the water before anyone sees it. That night, I pulled out the coffee can and counted the crumpled bills again. Still not enough. A few months later, Lance walked into Mel's. He was wearing a suit that didn't match the place-ordered black coffee and didn't speak much. I spilled half the pot on his table when I tripped over a mop bucket and the hot liquid soaked his papers. I stammered, "Apologies." He dabbed at his coat and said, "It's fine. Just bring me something clean to wear." I ran home, dug through Iris's closet, and brought back my grandfather's old corduroy jacket. Lance looked at it like I'd handed him a piece of living history. He laughed, really laughed, and put it on. "You've got guts," he said, "and vintage taste." He came back the next week, sat at the same booth, tipped well, didn't ask questions. The week after that, he brought a book for Emery about dragonflies. Said he'd overheard him talking about wings. Emery took to him faster than I did. One day, he pulled out a drawing of a dragonfly with labeled parts and explained the anatomy like a tiny professor. Lance listened. "Like it mattered, smart kid," he said afterward. "You ever think about science camp?" I shook my head. "I think about paying the electric bill." A week later, he dropped off a flyer and said he'd already covered the tuition. I wanted to say no. I wanted to guard my pride like a fence, but Emery was so excited and Iris just said, "Don't punish the boy because the man's decent," so I let him help. He didn't fix us. He didn't try. He just stayed. And after a while, that mattered more than anything else. He asked to meet the woman who raised me. I didn't expect her to recognize him. By the time Emery turned 35, he had built a life with the same quiet intensity he'd had as a boy. He earned a full scholarship to Johns Hopkins, finished medical school near the top of his class, and spent nearly a decade training to become a surgeon. He never rushed anything. He just kept going. When he finally opened his own clinic in Baltimore, I sent a single card with 2 words. "Proud always." He called me that night, choking up a little, and said I couldn't have done any of this without you. Mom, I didn't say what I was thinking, that he had done most of it on his own, that all I'd done was keep the lights on, feed him, fight for him, and love him even when I had nothing left for myself. Then came the call. It was a Tuesday again. Funny how life circles back. Emery had performed emergency surgery on a woman in her late 60s with a ruptured appendix. The case had been complicated, the timing tight. He stayed late into the night, monitoring her vitals, checking her charts. The woman pulled through. The next day, her husband showed up at the clinic with a tin of homemade cookies and shaky hands. "You saved her," he told Emery, his voice thick. "I can't explain what that means. You saved everything I have left." Emery thanked him politely and tried to leave it at that, but the man lingered. "What's your mother's name?" he asked. Emery blinked Charlotte. The man's eyes changed. He gripped Emery's shoulder and said, "Would you let me thank her in person?" "Please." Emery hesitated. "That's not something I arrange often," he said. "But I'll ask her. He called me that night. There's a man who wants to meet you," he said. "He said I saved his wife. That you're the reason I became the kind of man who could do that." I paused, spoon still in the pot of stew. "What's his name, Tom?" he said. "Tom Weller." I dropped the spoon. Iris was sitting in her rocker across the room. She looked up slowly, met my eyes, and said, "So they finally found the door." 3 days later, they pulled into the driveway in a pickup I hadn't seen in 35 years. It was older now, faded red, the kind of vehicle that sagged slightly on one side. From time, Tom stepped out first, slower, stiffer than I remembered, with a cane and a tremble in his jaw. Linda followed behind, her white cardigan clutched tight around her shoulders. I stood on the porch, hands dusted with flour. I hadn't told Emery everything, not yet. He came outside when he heard the car wiping his hands on a clinic form. He looked at me confused. "Mom?" I nodded toward the truck. "They said they wanted to thank the woman who raised you," I said. "Turns out they already knew her." The couple walked closer. Emery looked from their faces to mine. "Wait, you know them?" I swallowed Emery. I said quietly, "Meet your grandparents." Tom stopped short. His cane hit the gravel with a soft thud. His lips parted and his eyes went glassy. "We've missed you," he whispered. "Missed everything." Linda clutched her purse like a life vest. "We were wrong," she said, voice breaking. "We thought we had time to make it right." Emery stood still, his body caught between their faces and mine. The porch was quiet, except for the wind stirring the rose bushes. And for a moment, I didn't know if I should step forward or step back. They said, "Sorry, I told them it wasn't enough." We didn't talk on the porch. I opened the door and let them in because I wasn't going to make a show out of it, not for Emery, not for the neighbors, not even for myself. I just couldn't bear to have them standing out there like strays. Inside, Iris sat in her chair by the window, wrapped in a knitted shawl and holding a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird in her lap. She didn't look up when the door opened. She didn't have to. She always knew when ghosts came through. Tom and Linda stood awkwardly just past the rug, as if afraid the floor might give out beneath them. Lance was already home, standing in the kitchen with a mug in hand. He didn't say much, but his eyes scanned the room like he was ready to step in if anything snapped. I poured tea for everyone. My hands were steady, but my breath wasn't. Tom took the cup with both hands like it might slip from his grip. Linda kept hers in her lap untouched. Emery sat beside me on the couch, eyes darting between us all, trying to read a story he hadn't been given. It was Iris who broke the silence. She lifted her head, her voice dry but clear. "You didn't lose her," she said, eyes on Tom. "You threw her away. You just didn't think she'd grow stronger without you." Tom's mouth opened closed. His eyes brimmed with tears, but he didn't speak. Linda did. "We were scared," she said, her voice small. "I thought if we kept her under control, we could fix it. But then it got too big, too loud, and your father, well, he made a choice," Iris snapped. "And you followed." I stayed quiet, listening to the words bounce off the walls of the home I had built. Not with money, not with forgiveness, but with time and meals and quiet evenings where nothing hurt. Then Linda reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. She held it out to me with both hands. "I wrote this years ago," she said. "After Emery was born, I never sent it. I was ashamed. I didn't take it." I stared at the soft corners of the envelope, the faded ink of my name. "I wanted to," she added, "but I thought it wouldn't matter anymore." I finally reached out and took it, but I didn't open it. I placed it on the coffee table next to the sugar bowl and a photo of Emery from high school. The letter could wait. The truth had already arrived. "I don't want your guilt," I said finally. Tom looked up at me, his voice rough. Then what do you want? Nothing, I said, because I already have what you thought I'd never have, a son who loves me, a home full of light, a man who stays. Tom's shoulders sagged, his eyes filled again. I think about you every single day, Charlotte. You think about the girl you left, I corrected. You don't know the woman I became. Emery cleared his throat. I have a question, he said carefully. If I forgive them, would that hurt you? I turned to him, surprised. There was so much of me in his face, and yet something gentler, something more generous. I brushed my hand along his arm. No, I said. But don't call them family, not yet. He nodded. They're just people right now, I added. Not enemies, not saints, just people who were wrong. Linda let out a soft sob. Tom sat back in his chair, his hands trembling. I looked at them both and said, without anger, sorry is a beginning, but it doesn't buy a place back at the table. Then I stood up, gathered the empty teacups, and carried them to the sink. The sound of water running filled the room, covering the words that didn't come. Behind me, no one moved. I didn't need them to beg, I just needed them to stop lying. I poured another pot of tea, not because anyone asked for it, just because my hands needed something to do. The steam rose between us like a veil. I didn't speak again. I didn't need to. I had said what mattered. Tom and Linda sat on the edge of their chairs like they didn't know whether to stand or kneel, like they were waiting for a verdict, but there was no judgment left in me, just history. Emery stayed by my side. He didn't say much either, just rested his hand on mine like he'd done when he was 5 and afraid of thunderstorms. Lance moved through the kitchen with quiet steps, wiping down the counter that didn't need cleaning. Iris hadn't said a word since that one sharp sentence, but her eyes never left Tom. Then, as the clock ticked toward dusk, I stood. I'll fix a plate to take, I said, not asking if they wanted it. There's stew and cornbread. Take it or leave it, Linda whispered. Thank you. I nodded but didn't smile. They left with a brown paper bag and silence. On the porch, Tom turned to me. If we ever wanted to come back, someday, would you let us? I met his eyes, familiar and foreign all at once. I don't make promises I can't keep, I said, but I won't pretend anymore either. Not for you, not for anyone. He gave a small nod. No protest, no defense, just regret. Linda didn't look back. Inside the house, settled into its familiar hush. Iris had fallen asleep in her chair, book on her lap. Lance poured the rest of the tea into her cup, just in case she woke and wanted it warm. Emery followed me into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter watching me rinse the mugs. They seemed older than I expected, he said. They are, I replied, but not everything breaks just because it gets old. Some things harden. He was quiet for a moment. Then I'm glad they met you. Finally. I dried my hands and turned to face him. I didn't do this for them. I did it so you'd know the truth, that it wasn't me who left. They told that version for too long. Emery nodded. I know I picked up the envelope Linda had left and tucked it into the drawer by the stove. I wasn't ready to read it. Maybe I never would, but it was proof of something that once. Even if she couldn't say it out loud, she'd wanted to. That night, as the fire in the hearth dimmed and the house folded in on itself like an old quilt, Iris stirred. You know what hurts worse than being forgotten, she said, eyes still closed. What? I asked, soft. Being remembered only when it's convenient. I kissed her forehead. The next morning, I found Emery in the yard, hands deep in the soil where the winter roses used to bloom. He looked up. Spring's late this year. I nodded. It'll come anyway. He smiled, then stood and brushed off his palms. From the porch, I looked out at the quiet street, the same one I'd walked down alone 35 years earlier with a duffel bag and no place to land, and I thought I didn't vanish. They just told the story like I did.